The sound of cruel laughter echoed across the dusty main street of Watsonville, California, as Zoe Blackburn stood exposed on the auction block, her cheeks burning with humiliation as the auctioneer gestured dramatically toward her full figure. The year was 1876, and the drought had taken everything from her farm, her parents, and now her dignity. "What do we have here, folks?" the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the crowd gathered in the sweltering August heat. "A big girl with plenty of meat on her bones. Could cook for an army, I reckon. Starting bid at $10 for this fine domestic help." Zoe clenched her fists at her sides, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. At 23 years old, she never imagined she'd find herself being sold into indentured servitude to pay off her late father's debts. The bank had taken their farm 2 weeks ago, and with her mother long dead from consumption, she had no one left to turn to. "Look at the size of her." Someone shouted. "Better reinforce your floorboards," another voice joined in. "Hope you got extra feed stored for winter." The crowd's laughter grew louder, men elbowing each other and women hiding smirks behind their fans. Zoe tried to keep her head high, but each barb struck deep. She'd always been a bigger woman, tall and full-figured, and though her strength had served her well working the farm, here in town it was just another reason for ridicule. $12, called a red-faced man near the front, leering at her in a way that made her stomach turn. 15, countered another, an elderly rancher known for working his help to the bone. Zoe felt like a prized cow being assessed for slaughter. Her throat tightened as she scanned the crowd for even a single sympathetic face. There were none. Most townsfolk averted their eyes while others openly enjoyed the spectacle. $20, called a thin, reedy voice from the back. Bartholomew Wilkins, the owner of the saloon, known for hiring girls for purposes beyond serving drinks. Zoe's blood ran cold. Then, a voice like thunder cut through the crowd. $100. The crowd fell silent, heads turning to find the source of the outrageous bid. A path cleared, revealing a tall figure at the back of the gathering. Jacob Everett stood with his hand raised, his blue eyes blazing beneath the brim of his weathered hat. His jaw was set in determination, his gaze sweeping over the suddenly silent crowd with unmistakable contempt. The auctioneer stuttered. "I have $100 from Mr. Everett." "Do I hear 105? No one spoke. Jacob Everett's reputation preceded him. Though not a particularly wealthy man, he was known throughout Watsonville and beyond as one of the most formidable cowboys to ride the California ranges. His cattle operation north of town was modest but successful, and more importantly, he wasn't a man anyone chose to cross, going once. The auctioneer called out hesitantly, his eyes darting around for another bid. Wilkins cleared his throat. 100, and Jacob cut him off with a single look, stepping forward through the crowd. "I said $100, he repeated, each word distinct and threatening. His hand rested casually on the revolver at his hip, and his gaze fixed on Wilkins with such intensity that the saloon owner actually took a step back, going twice. The auctioneer looked nervously between Jacob and the rest of the suddenly quiet crowd, and sold. To Mr. Jacob Everett for $100. The gavel came down with finality. Jacob approached the auction block, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. He didn't look at the auctioneer or the bank representative who'd arranged the sale. His eyes were fixed solely on Zoe, not with the appraising look she'd endured from others, but with something resembling respect. "Miss Blackburn," he said simply, offering her his hand to help her down from the platform. Zoe hesitated, unsure what to make of this unexpected turn of events. She'd seen Jacob Everett in town occasionally over the years, but they'd never exchanged more than a nod in passing. He was something of a loner, having arrived in Watsonville about 5 years earlier and establishing his ranch without much interaction with the townspeople. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not here," he replied quietly. Then, more loudly for the benefit of those still watching, "I could use some help around my place. Let's get your things." The crowd began to disperse, some looking disappointed that their entertainment had been cut short, others whispering behind their hands. Jacob guided Zoe away from the auction block with a gentle but firm hand on her elbow. "I don't have many things," Zoe admitted as they walked. "Just a trunk at the hotel. The bank took everything else." Jacob nodded, his expression unreadable beneath his hat. "We'll get your trunk and then head to my ranch. It's about an hour's ride north." They retrieved Zoe's meager possessions from the hotel where she'd been staying since losing the farm. The hotel owner had been letting her stay on credit, knowing the auction was coming. Now he seemed relieved to see her go, especially in the company of someone who could actually pay. Jacob loaded her trunk onto the back of his wagon, then helped her up onto the seat. She watched as he paid the hotel owner, settling not just the room bill but also ordering supplies to be delivered to his ranch later in the week. It was all done with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a man accustomed to handling his business without unnecessary words. As they pulled away from Watsonville, Zoe felt both relief and apprehension. She was grateful to be away from the prying eyes and cruel comments, but she was now essentially the property of a man she barely knew. "Mr. Everett," she began, once the town was behind them, "I appreciate what you did back there, but I need to know what you expect of me." Jacob kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands steady on the reins. "I expect you to work, Miss Blackburn. My ranch needs tending, as does my house. I've been managing alone, but there's more than enough work for 2 people. "And that's all," Zoe pressed, needing to be certain. At this, Jacob turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "That's all. You'll have your own room, you'll be treated with respect, and you'll be paid a fair wage. After 6 months, the debt will be considered settled and you can stay on as a proper employee or go wherever you please." Zoe blinked in surprise. "Paid? But you bought my contract." "I paid off your father's debt," Jacob corrected. "I didn't buy you. There's a difference, Miss Blackburn, though I reckon not everyone in Watsonville sees it that way." For the first time that day, Zoe felt something other than fear and shame. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to find words for the depth of her gratitude. Jacob nodded once and returned his attention to the road. They traveled in silence for a while, the wagon bumping along the dusty trail that led north into the rolling hills that separated the fertile valley from the coastal mountains beyond. "Why did you do it?" Zoe finally asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment he'd placed his bid. Jacob didn't answer immediately, seeming to consider his words carefully. "I've seen how people can treat each other," he said finally, "and I didn't much like what I was seeing today." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, but Zoe knew better than to pry. Instead, she watched the landscape change as they traveled farther from town, golden hills dotted with oak trees and occasional stands of pine. It was beautiful country, even in the grip of the summer heat. "My ranch isn't much compared to some," Jacob said after a while. 200 acres, about 60 head of cattle, small cabin, barn, corral, but it's mine, free and clear." "It sounds wonderful," Zoe said honestly. After losing her family's farm, the idea of a place that was secure, that couldn't be taken away, held immense appeal. Jacob glanced at her. "It's hard work." "I'm no stranger to hard work, Mr. Everett. I've been running our farm alongside my father since I was 14 and on my own since he took ill last year." Something like approval flickered across Jacob's face. Good, and it's Jacob. Mr. Everett makes me sound like my father. Then I'm Zoe, she replied. Not the big girl or any of those other things they called me today. Jacob's jaw tightened. You won't hear those names at my ranch, Zoe. You have my word on that. As they crested a hill, Jacob's ranch came into view in the valley below. It was indeed modest but well kept. The cabin was larger than Zoe had expected, constructed of solid logs with a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, with a corral attached and several smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. Fields of hay stretched to the north, while cattle grazed on the hillsides to the east. It's lovely, Zoe said, meaning it. After weeks of uncertainty, the sight of this peaceful homestead was like a balm to her soul. Jacob guided the wagon down the slope toward the cabin. It's home, he said simply, but there was pride in his voice. As they pulled up in front of the cabin, a dog came bounding around the corner, barking excitedly. It was a large, shaggy beast, some mix of shepherd and hound, with one ear that stood straight up and another that flopped over. That's Scout, Jacob said as he set the brake on the wagon. He makes a lot of noise, but he's friendly enough once he knows you belong here. Belong here. The words sent an unexpected warmth through Zoe's chest. Jacob jumped down from the wagon and went around to help her down, his hands strong and steady as they circled her waist. He set her gently on the ground, then whistled for the dog. Scout, this is Zoe. She's staying with us now. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing at Zoe's skirts. She held out her hand, letting him get her scent. After a moment, his tail began to wag and he pushed his head against her palm. He likes you, Jacob observed, sounding pleased. Animals usually do, Zoe replied, scratching behind Scout's ears. My father always said it was because they could sense a kind heart. Jacob nodded. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Zoe said softly, feeling the familiar pang of grief. He just wasn't very good with money, especially after my mother died. The drought these past 2 years didn't help. Jacob unloaded her trunk from the wagon and carried it into the cabin. Zoe followed, Scout trotting at her heels as if he'd appointed himself her personal guardian. The interior of the cabin was simple but surprisingly comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a solid table surrounded by 4 chairs, a stone fireplace with a cooking hook, and a rocking chair near the window. Everything was clean and well organized, if somewhat sparse. 2 doors led off the main room. That's your room, Jacob said, nodding toward the door on the right as he set down her trunk. Mine's on the left. The washroom is out back. It's not fancy, but there's a pump for water and a tub if you want to bathe. Zoe opened the door to her room, surprised to find a pleasant space with a real bed, not just a cot as she'd expected, a small dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains to the west. The bed was neatly made with a patchwork quilt in shades of blue and green. This is very nice, she said, turning back to Jacob. He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. It was my mother's quilt, been sitting in the trunk for years, figured it might as well be used. Zoe ran her hand over the quilt, touched by this small connection to his past. It's beautiful. Thank you. Jacob cleared his throat. I'll let you get settled. I need to see to the horses and check on a few things. We can talk about your duties over supper. Left alone, Zoe unpacked her few belongings, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, some undergarments, a brush, a small hand mirror that had been her mother's, and a worn Bible. It didn't take long, and when she was finished, she stood in the doorway of her new room, taking in the quiet solitude of the ranch. After the chaos and humiliation of the morning, the peace was welcome. She could hear birds singing outside, the distant lowing of cattle, and the sound of Jacob working in the barn. It was almost possible to believe that everything might be all right after all. Almost. Zoe knew that one act of kindness, however significant, didn't erase the reality of her situation. She was still essentially a servant, working to pay off a debt that wasn't truly hers. And when the 6 months were over, what then? The farm was gone. Her parents were gone. She had no money and nowhere to go, but those were concerns for another day. For now, she had shelter, safety, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had seen her at her lowest moment and offered her dignity instead of derision. It would have to be enough. Zoe decided to make herself useful while Jacob was outside. She examined the kitchen area, finding it reasonably well stocked but clearly the domain of a bachelor who valued function over comfort. She located flour, salt, and lard, and set about making biscuits to accompany whatever Jacob had planned for supper. By the time Jacob returned, the cabin was filled with the aroma of fresh baked biscuits, and Zoe had taken inventory of his supplies, mentally planning meals for the coming days. Jacob paused in the doorway, hat in his hand, looking surprised. "You didn't have to cook." "I wanted to," Zoe replied. "I thought I'd start being useful right away. Besides, cooking calms me." She didn't add that after the events of the day, she had needed calming. Jacob nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Smells good." He hung his hat on a peg by the door and went to the wash basin to clean up. Zoe noticed the careful way he moved, favoring his left side slightly. "Are you hurt?" Jacob glanced at her, then shook his head. "Old injury. Acts up sometimes when I've been working hard." "What happened? If you don't mind my asking." Jacob dried his hands on a towel. "War injury. Took a bullet at Chancellorsville. It's long healed, but it reminds me it's there now and then." "You fought for the Union?" Zoe asked, surprised. Most California men who'd fought in the war had done so for the Union, but Jacob's accent held a hint of something Southern. "Yes," he said simply, offering no further explanation. They ate supper together at the table, a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and Zoe's biscuits. Jacob seemed to appreciate her cooking, eating 3 biscuits with evident enjoyment. "These are good," he said. "Better than anything I've managed." "Thank you. I enjoy cooking when I have the opportunity." Zoe hesitated, then added, "My mother taught me. She said a well-cooked meal could mend most troubles." "Wise woman," Jacob commented. "My mother believed the same. She was from Georgia originally. Could make cornbread that would make you believe in miracles." It was the most personal information he'd volunteered, and Zoe treasured it like a gift. "Is that where you're from, Georgia?" Jacob shook his head. "Virginia. Left when I was 17 to fight in the war, never went back." The way he said it made it clear that there was more to the story, but also that he wasn't inclined to share it. Zoe respected his privacy. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep hidden. "As for your duties," Jacob said, changing the subject, "I'll need help with the general running of the place. Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden. Can you milk a cow?" Zoe nodded. "Since I was a child." "Good, I've got 2. They provide more than enough for me, but I could sell the extra in town if we make butter and cheese." "I can do that," Zoe assured him. "My mother taught me to make both. We used to sell them at the town market before she got sick." Jacob looked pleased. "That would be helpful. I don't get to town more than once a month if I can help it." "You don't care for Watsonville?" Zoe asked, though she thought she could guess the answer after what she'd witnessed that day. "I don't care much for towns in general," Jacob said. "Too many people, too close together. Brings out the worst in folks sometimes." "Like today," Zoe said quietly. Jacob's expression darkened. "Yes, like today." He pushed his plate away, finished with his meal. "Those people, they don't know you. What they think doesn't matter." "It shouldn't matter," Zoe agreed. "But it's hard not to let it hurt all the same." Jacob looked at her directly then, his blue eyes intense. You've got nothing to be ashamed of, Zoe Blackburn. Nothing at all. The conviction in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. It had been so long since anyone had defended her, had seen her as something other than a burden or a problem to be solved. "Thank you," she managed to say, "for everything today." Jacob nodded once, then stood and carried his plate to the wash basin. "I'll show you around the rest of the place tomorrow. For now, you should rest. It's been a long day." Zoe couldn't argue with that. The emotional strain of the auction, combined with the relief of her unexpected rescue and the uncertainty of her new situation, had left her exhausted. She cleaned up after their meal, then bid Jacob good night and retired to her room. Through the thin wall, she could hear him moving about in his own room, the creaking of floorboards and the soft thud of boots being removed. It was strange to be sharing a home with a man who was essentially a stranger. But somehow, Zoe felt safer here than she had in weeks. She changed into her nightgown, braided her long brown hair, and slipped beneath the patchwork quilt. The bed was more comfortable than she'd expected, and the quiet of the countryside was a welcome change from the noise of the hotel in town. As she drifted toward sleep, Zoe found herself wondering about the enigmatic Jacob Everett. What had brought him to California after the war? Why did he live alone, miles from town, with only his dog for company? And most puzzling of all, why had he intervened today, spending $100 to rescue a woman he didn't even know? These questions followed her into her dreams, where blue eyes watched her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster, and a deep voice promised that she had nothing to be ashamed of. Nothing at all. The next morning, Zoe woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting to see the faded wallpaper of the hotel room. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she remembered where she was in Jacob Everett's cabin, miles from Watsonville, starting a new chapter of her life whether she was ready for it or not. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 spare dresses, a practical brown cotton that had seen better days but was still serviceable for work. After braiding her hair and pinning it up, she emerged from her room to find Jacob already at the table, a cup of coffee in hand. "Morning," he greeted her, rising when she entered. "Coffee's hot. There's bread and some preserves if you're hungry." "Thank you," Zoe replied, touched by his courtesy. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "You're up early." "Sun comes up, so do I," Jacob said with a slight shrug. "Ranch doesn't run itself." Zoe nodded, understanding the rhythm of rural life. "What would you like me to start with today?" Jacob considered this as he sipped his coffee. "Thought I'd show you around first, get you familiar with the place. Then maybe you could see to the garden. It's been producing, but it could use a woman's touch. I'm better with cattle than vegetables." After a simple breakfast, Jacob took her on a tour of the property. The barn was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with stalls for 4 horses, though only 2 were currently occupied: Jacob's bay gelding, Thunder, and the mare that had pulled their wagon, a gentle sorrel named Penny. "You ride?" Jacob asked as Zoe stroked Penny's nose. "Since I was a child," Zoe confirmed. "Not as much in recent years with all the work on the farm, but I'm comfortable on horseback." Jacob nodded. "Good. Penny's yours to use whenever you need. She's getting older but still has plenty of good years left, sweet-tempered too." The tour continued to the chicken coop, where a dozen hens scratched and pecked, and then to the cow barn, where 2 jerseys lowed softly in their stalls. Jacob showed her the smokehouse, the root cellar, and finally the garden. It was larger than Zoe had expected, with neat rows of various vegetables: corn, beans, tomatoes, carrots, and more, though weeds had begun to encroach in places, and some plants looked in need of attention. "It's a fine garden," Zoe said, already mentally planning how she would restore it to peak condition. With some care, it could produce enough to see you through winter with plenty preserved. Us, Jacob corrected quietly. See us through winter. Zoe glanced at him, surprised by the inclusive term. I'll only be here for 6 months, remember, until the debt is paid. Jacob's expression was unreadable as he surveyed the garden. Winter comes early in these hills. You might still be here when the first snow falls. The thought hadn't occurred to Zoe. She'd been focusing so intently on the immediate future that she hadn't considered the changing seasons. If snow made travel difficult, she might indeed find herself spending the winter at Jacob's ranch, debt paid or not. I suppose we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, she said finally. Jacob nodded. One day at a time is how I've always managed. They returned to the cabin and Jacob gathered his hat and gloves. I need to check on the herd. They're grazing in the north pasture. I'll be back by midday. I'll have lunch ready, Zoe promised. After Jacob left, Zoe set to work on the garden. It was hard physical labor, especially in the growing heat of the day, but there was something satisfying about bringing order to the tangled rows, freeing the vegetables from the choking weeds. She found garden tools in a small shed nearby and used them to cultivate around the plants, giving them room to breathe and grow. By midday, she had cleared nearly half the garden and harvested a bounty of ripe vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, and early carrots. She returned to the cabin, her arms full of produce, feeling more accomplished than she had in weeks. After washing up, Zoe prepared a simple but hearty lunch of bacon, tomatoes, and the last of the biscuits from the night before. She was just setting the food on the table when Jacob returned, bringing with him the scent of sun-warmed earth and horses. Garden looks better already, he commented as he washed his hands. You've been busy. It felt good to work, Zoe admitted, to create order from chaos. Jacob's lips curved in the ghost of a smile. Know that feeling well. As they ate, Jacob told her about the cattle, how many head he had, their breeding cycle, his plans for the fall drive to the railhead. Zoe listened with genuine interest. Though her family's farm had focused on crops rather than livestock, she understood the principles of animal husbandry and the challenges of making a living from the land. You manage all this alone? She asked, impressed by the scope of his operation. Hire hands for the drive and branding, Jacob explained. Rest of the time it's just me and Scout. He glanced at the dog who lay by the door watching them with alert eyes. Been that way for 5 years now. And before that? Zoe asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Jacob's expression closed off slightly. Worked other ranches, saved my money, bought this place when the previous owner decided to try his luck in the goldfields. He pushed back from the table. Speaking of work, I should get back to it. Those fences on the east side won't mend themselves. Zoe nodded, accepting his reluctance to discuss his past. I'll finish with the garden this afternoon, then see what can be done with the house. Jacob paused at the door, turning back to look at her. You don't have to do everything in one day, Zoe. This isn't a race. I know, she assured him. But I'd rather be busy than idle. Something like understanding flickered in Jacob's eyes. Being busy keeps the thoughts at bay, he said quietly, as if sharing a confidence. I know that dance well. Before Zoe could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. The days fell into a pattern after that. Zoe rose early to prepare breakfast and pack a lunch for Jacob if he was working far afield. Mornings were spent on household tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending, while afternoons were devoted to the garden, which thrived under her attention. By the end of her first week at the ranch, the vegetables were growing vigorously, free from weeds and properly staked where needed. Jacob seemed to appreciate her efforts, though he was a man of few words. His approval came in small gestures, a nod when he surveyed the flourishing garden, a murmured "good" when he tasted a new dish she prepared, an extra log brought in for her bedroom fire on a chilly evening. For her part, Zoe found herself warming to the quiet cowboy. Jacob was nothing like the men she'd known in town, no false charm or hidden agendas, just straightforward honesty and a work ethic that matched her own. He never commented on her size, never made her feel less than worthy of respect, and always treated her as an equal partner in the running of the ranch, not as a servant. It was a refreshing change, and as the days turned into weeks, Zoe realized she was genuinely happy for the first time in a long while. The ranch was becoming home in a way she hadn't expected, and Jacob, still somewhat of a mystery, was becoming someone she looked forward to seeing each day. September arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and changing colors to the landscape. The garden yielded a bountiful harvest, keeping Zoe busy with canning and preserving. Jacob built more shelves in the root cellar to accommodate the dozens of jars she filled with tomatoes, beans, corn, and various pickled vegetables. "Never seen so much food put by," he commented one evening as they carried the latest batch of jars to the cellar. "Could feed an army through winter with all this. Better to have too much than too little," Zoe replied. "My mother always said a full cellar meant peace of mind when the snow flies." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "Your mother sounds like she was a practical woman." "She was," Zoe agreed, arranging the jars neatly on the new shelves. "Taught me everything I know about running a household. Said a woman should always be able to stand on her own 2 feet, even if she never needs to." "Wise advice," Jacob said. He hesitated, then added, "My mother was the same. Strong-willed, independent, drove my father crazy sometimes, but he loved her for it. It was one of the few times he'd volunteered information about his family, and Zoe treasured these rare glimpses into his past." "What happened to them?" she asked carefully. "Your parents." Jacob was quiet for so long that Zoe thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Fever took my mother when I was 15. Father died during the war, Confederate soldier." Zoe's eyes widened in surprise. "But you fought for the Union?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "Yes." The simple answer contained worlds of complexity, hinting at a family divided by the war that had torn the nation apart. Zoe wanted to ask more, but Jacob's expression made it clear that the subject was closed. As they walked back to the cabin in the gathering dusk, Zoe felt a growing awareness of Jacob beside her, the solid presence of him, the quiet strength he exuded without effort. In the weeks since he'd rescued her from the auction block, he had become more than just her employer. He was becoming her friend, and perhaps, whispered a small voice in her heart, something more. Zoe quickly silenced that thought. Jacob had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, but he had given no indication that his feelings were anything beyond those of a decent man helping someone in need. Besides, she was still technically in his employ, working to pay off her father's debt. Any thoughts beyond that would only lead to disappointment. The next day brought an unexpected development. Jacob announced over breakfast that he needed to go into Watsonville for supplies. "Thought you might want to come along," he added, watching her reaction carefully. "Could use help selecting fabric for new curtains. The ones we have are hardly keeping out the drafts." Zoe's stomach knotted at the thought of returning to town, facing the people who had mocked her so cruelly. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." Jacob's expression softened. "You can't avoid town forever, Zoe. Better to face them head-on than let them think they scared you away." "Is that what you did?" Zoe asked, recognizing that Jacob himself rarely went to town. A shadow crossed his face. "My reasons for avoiding Watsonville have nothing to do with fear." Then what? Zoe pressed, emboldened by weeks of growing familiarity. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. People talk, make assumptions, draw conclusions based on half-truths and gossip. He met her gaze directly. I prefer my own company to that of people who judge what they don't understand. Zoe nodded slowly, sensing that his words carried personal significance beyond their surface meaning. But you still think I should go? I think, Jacob said carefully, that hiding gives power to those who have wronged you, and I think you're stronger than you know. His confidence in her was like a balm to Zoe's wounded spirit. If Jacob Everett, who had seen her at her most vulnerable moment, believed in her strength, perhaps she could believe in it too. All right, she agreed. I'll go. They set out for town an hour later, the wagon loaded with goods to sell butter and cheese that Zoe had made from the cow's milk, eggs from the chickens, and some of the abundant vegetables from the garden. Jacob had insisted they take these items to trade, pointing out that there was more than enough for their own needs. As they approached Watsonville, Zoe felt her anxiety rising. She smoothed her dress, her best one, a dark blue calico that Jacob had insisted she wear rather than her work clothes, and adjusted her bonnet. Jacob, noticing her nervousness, gave her a reassuring nod. Head high, he said simply. Zoe squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, drawing strength from his quiet support. Watsonville was busy that day, the main street crowded with wagons and riders. As Jacob guided their wagon toward the general store, Zoe felt eyes turning in their direction. She heard the whispers start, saw the nudges and pointed fingers. Isn't that the Blackburn girl, the one from the auction? What's she doing with Everett? Jacob ignored the whispers, helping Zoe down from the wagon with the same respect he always showed her. His hand lingered on her arm for a moment, a silent reminder of his support, before he began unloading the items they'd brought to trade. Inside the general store, the whispers continued. The storekeeper, Mr. Peterson, raised his eyebrows when he saw Zoe with Jacob, but greeted them politely enough. Mr. Everett, Miss Blackburn, what can I do for you today? Need supplies, Jacob said, handing over a list. And Miss Blackburn would like to look at your fabric selection. We're in need of new curtains. Mr. Peterson nodded, taking the list. Of course. Martha can show you the fabrics, Miss Blackburn. She's in the back. Zoe followed his gesture to where Mrs. Peterson was organizing bolts of cloth. The woman looked up as Zoe approached, her expression curious but not unkind. Miss Blackburn, isn't it? I heard you were working out at the Everett Ranch now. That's right, Zoe confirmed, keeping her voice steady. I'm looking for curtain fabric, something sturdy that will keep out the drafts. Mrs. Peterson seemed to appreciate the practical approach. I have just the thing, heavy cotton drill in several colors, or there's wool if you prefer, though it's more expensive. As they discussed fabrics, Zoe gradually relaxed. Mrs. Peterson treated her no differently than any other customer, focusing on the transaction rather than on gossip or judgment. By the time Jacob joined them, having arranged for the other supplies, Zoe had selected a warm, rust-colored cotton that would complement the cabin's wooden walls. Good choice, Jacob commented, examining the fabric. How much do we need? The casual we warmed Zoe in a way she hadn't expected. It implied partnership, shared decisions, a future beyond the 6-month contract that technically defined their relationship. With the fabric purchased and arrangements made for the delivery of their larger supplies, Jacob and Zoe prepared to leave the store. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it isn't the big girl from the auction block." Bartholomew Wilkins stood across the street, a smirk on his thin face. Several men lounging outside his saloon laughed at his comment, their eyes fixed on Zoe with a mixture of amusement and something more predatory. Zoe felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Jacob stepped slightly in front of her, his body language protective without being possessive. "Wilkins," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "Still bitter about losing the bid?" The saloon owner's smirk faltered. "Just surprised to see you in town, Everett. Thought you preferred to keep to yourself these days, but I guess even a loner gets lonely sometimes." His gaze slid to Zoe. "Though I'd have thought you'd want someone a bit more delicate." Jacob's hand moved to rest on his revolver, not drawing it but making his readiness clear. "I'd suggest you watch your tongue when speaking about Miss Blackburn. She deserves your respect," Wilkins scoffed. "Respect? For a farm girl sold to pay daddy's debts." Jacob took a step forward, his eyes cold. "Every person deserves respect until they prove otherwise, Wilkins. You proved otherwise a long time ago." The saloon owner's face darkened with anger, but something in Jacob's stance made him hesitate. The tension in the air was palpable, the street suddenly quieter as passers-by sensed the potential for violence. Zoe placed a gentle hand on Jacob's arm. "It's not worth it," she said softly, for his ears alone. "Let's go home." Jacob held Wilkins's gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "You're right." He turned back to the wagon, helping Zoe up onto the seat before climbing up beside her. As they pulled away from the general store, Zoe could feel the eyes of the town following them. But this time, the stares didn't hurt as much. With Jacob beside her, his quiet strength a shield against their judgment, she found she could bear their scrutiny with dignity. "Thank you," she said as they left the town behind, "for defending me back there." Jacob kept his eyes on the road. "Nothing to thank me for. Wilkins is a snake. Always has been." "There seems to be some history between you two," Zoe observed. Jacob's jaw tightened. "He's one of those men who builds himself up by tearing others down. I've had my fill of that type in this lifetime." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the tension of the town encounter gradually fading as the peaceful countryside surrounded them. Finally, Jacob spoke again, his voice softer than before. "You did well today, Zoe. Held your head high, just like I said." Zoe smiled, realizing that he was right. Despite her initial fear, she had faced the town and emerged with her dignity intact. "It was easier with you there." Jacob glanced at her, something warm in his blue eyes. "You're stronger than you know, would have managed fine without me." "Perhaps," Zoe conceded. "But I'm glad I didn't have to." The look that passed between them then was charged with something new, a recognition, perhaps, that their relationship had shifted into territory beyond employer and employee. For a breathless moment, Zoe thought Jacob might say something more, might put into words the changing dynamic between them. But he simply nodded and returned his attention to the road, leaving Zoe to wonder if she had imagined the connection, or if Jacob felt it too, but was hesitant to acknowledge it. As they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Zoe felt a surge of emotion. In just a few short weeks, this place had begun to feel like home in a way the town never had. And the man beside her had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The following weeks brought a shift in the rhythm of ranch life as autumn deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and there was an urgency to complete the outdoor tasks before winter arrived. Jacob spent long hours mending fences, repairing the roof of the barn, and ensuring that everything was secure against the coming weather. Zoe, meanwhile, continued her preserving efforts, determined that the root cellar would be stocked to bursting before the first snow. She also began making new curtains from the fabric they'd purchased in town, working in the evenings by the light of the oil lamp, while Jacob sat across from her, mending harnesses or reading one of the few books he owned. These quiet evenings became Zoe's favorite part of the day. There was something deeply satisfying about sharing the peaceful domesticity with Jacob. Each of them engaged in their own tasks, but connected by the comfortable silence between them. Occasionally, they would talk about the ranch, about books they had read, about their childhoods before loss and war had changed everything. Jacob remained reticent about certain aspects of his past, particularly his service in the Union Army and his relationship with his Confederate father. But he slowly revealed other pieces of himself: his love of astronomy, his skill with woodworking, his dream of expanding the ranch someday. In turn, Zoe shared her own dreams of having a home that was truly hers, of perhaps opening a small bakery someday, a dream her practical father had discouraged, of seeing more of the world beyond California. "You could still do those things," Jacob said one evening as they sat by the fire. "When your 6 months are up, you'll have wages saved, could go anywhere, be anything you wanted." There was something in his tone that Zoe couldn't quite interpret, a forced casualness that suggested the topic mattered more to him than he was letting on. "I suppose," she agreed, her needle pausing in its work, "but I've been thinking. I might like to stay on here if you'll have me, as a proper employee, I mean." She hurried to add, "The ranch suits me and there's always plenty of work." Jacob looked up from the bridle he was mending, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You'd be welcome to stay," he said after a moment. "More than welcome." Something about the way he said it, the quiet intensity behind the simple words, made Zoe's heart beat faster. But before she could respond, Scout began barking outside, the sound urgent and alarming. Jacob was on his feet in an instant, reaching for the rifle that hung above the door. "Stay here," he instructed, his demeanor shifting from relaxed to alert in the blink of an eye. "What is it?" Zoe asked, setting aside her sewing. "Probably nothing," Jacob said, though his tense posture belied his casual words. "Could be coyotes or a mountain lion. Scout doesn't bark like that for no reason, though." He disappeared out the door, leaving Zoe alone in the suddenly too quiet cabin. She moved to the window, peering out into the darkness, but could see nothing beyond the small circle of light cast by the lamp Jacob had taken with him. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Zoe strained her ears for any sound that might indicate what was happening. The barking had stopped, which she hoped was a good sign, but the silence was almost more unnerving. Finally, the door opened and Jacob returned, followed by Scout. But they weren't alone. A man Zoe had never seen before stumbled in after them, supported by Jacob's strong arm. "Zoe, this is Tom Harris," Jacob said, helping the stranger to a chair. "He's hurt, shot in the leg." Zoe immediately set aside her questions and concerns, moving to examine the wounded man. Tom Harris was younger than Jacob, perhaps 25, with a shock of red hair and freckles across his pale face. His left pant leg was soaked with blood, and his complexion was alarmingly white. "We need to clean and bandage the wound," she said, practical instincts taking over. "And he needs water and food. He looks half-starved." Jacob nodded, already moving to fetch water and the medical supplies they kept on hand for emergencies. "Tom's a friend," he explained briefly. "Works as a ranch hand over at the Pearson place." Zoe didn't press for more information as they worked together to treat the young man's injury. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his thigh, missing the bone and major blood vessels, a lucky break, though the wound was still serious and at risk of infection. Tom himself was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently as they cleaned and bandaged his leg. Once they had him settled on a pallet near the fire with blankets to ward off shock, Jacob motioned for Zoe to join him outside. The night air was crisp, stars blazing overhead in a clear sky. Jacob led Zoe a short distance from the cabin, his expression grave in the moonlight. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice low. "Tom's in trouble, serious trouble." "What kind of trouble leads to a man being shot?" Zoe asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew the answer. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The kind that involves a rich rancher's daughter and a father who doesn't approve of his only child running off with a hired hand. Mr. Pearson shot him." Zoe gasped, appalled. "Caught them trying to leave together," Jacob confirmed. "Shot Tom, locked his daughter in her room. Tom managed to get away, knew he could come here." "Because you're friends," Zoe said, trying to make sense of the situation. Jacob hesitated. "Because he knows I understand his situation. And because he knows I'll help him." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't the first time Jacob had offered sanctuary to someone in trouble, and Zoe was struck again by how little she really knew about the quiet cowboy who had come to mean so much to her. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Get him well enough to travel," Jacob said simply. "Then help them both get away. Somewhere Pearson can't find them." "Both," Zoe repeated. "You mean you're going to help the daughter escape too?" Jacob nodded, his expression resolute. "Sarah Pearson is 18 years old. Old enough to make her own choices, including who she loves. Her father has no right to keep her prisoner or to shoot a man for loving her." There was a passion in his voice that Zoe had never heard before, a personal conviction that went beyond abstract principles of right and wrong. She wondered, not for the first time, what experiences had shaped this man who valued freedom and personal choice so fiercely. "It's dangerous," she pointed out. "Pearson is one of the most powerful men in the county if he finds out you're helping them." "He won't," Jacob said confidently. "And even if he did, I can handle Pearson." Zoe wasn't so sure. George Pearson owned thousands of acres and employed dozens of men. He had the sheriff in his pocket and enough money to buy whatever justice he wanted. Going against him was no small matter. "I won't ask you to be part of this," Jacob added, his tone softening. "If you'd rather not know the details, I understand. It's my problem, not yours." Zoe straightened her spine, looking him directly in the eye. "I'm already part of it, Jacob. I help treat Tom's wounds. I'm living under your roof. Whatever comes, we face it together." Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, surprise, followed by a warmth that made Zoe's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her, might pull her into his arms. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Together, then." The word hung between them, pregnant with meaning beyond its simple syllables. It was a promise, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, a bond that went far beyond their initial arrangement. As they walked back to the cabin, Zoe felt both fear and exhilaration. She was now complicit in a plan that could have serious consequences, but she was also, for perhaps the first time in her life, making a choice based on what she believed was right rather than what was expected of her. And she was doing it alongside a man who saw her strength rather than her size, who valued her courage rather than her compliance. Whatever came next, she would face it with her head high, just as Jacob had taught her. The next few days were tense as they nursed Tom back to health, while keeping watch for any sign that Pearson's men were searching the area. Jacob moved the cattle to a more distant pasture to explain his frequent absences as he scouted the surrounding countryside, ensuring they had clear escape routes if needed. Zoe took charge of Tom's care, changing his bandages, preparing nourishing meals to help him regain his strength, and listening to his fevered ramblings about Sarah and their plans for the future. She came to like the young ranch hand, whose devotion to his sweetheart was evident in every word he spoke of her. "She's the most beautiful girl in the county," Tom told Zoe during his more lucid moments. Could have had her pick of rich suitors, but she chose me. Said she'd rather live in a shack with someone who loved her for herself than in a mansion with someone who only wanted her father's money. She sounds like a wise young woman, Zoe replied, adjusting his pillow. And a brave one. Tom's eyes filled with worry. I hope she's all right. Her father has a terrible temper, if he's hurt her because of me. Try not to worry, Zoe soothed. Jacob is making arrangements. He'll make sure she's safe. And indeed, Jacob returned late on the third day with news. He had made contact with one of the house servants at the Pearson Ranch, a woman who had known Sarah since childhood and was sympathetic to the young couple's plight. Through this ally, he had learned that Sarah was unharmed, though still confined to her room. More importantly, he had managed to get a message to her, letting her know that Tom was alive and that help was coming. The plan is to move in 2 days' time, Jacob informed them that night, his voice low despite the unlikelihood of being overheard so far from town. Sarah's maid will help her slip away during the evening meal. There's a spot where the property wall meets the creek. She can get out that way without being seen. I'll be waiting with horses. And then, Zoe asked. Then we bring her here, Jacob said. Just for a night or two while Tom finishes healing. After that, they'll head north. I have a friend near Sacramento who can help them start fresh where Pearson can't reach them. Tom pushed himself up on his elbows, wincing at the pain in his leg but determined to be part of the conversation. I can't thank you enough, Jacob, both of you, risking so much for us. Jacob shook his head. No thanks needed, just doing what's right. Zoe studied him as he spoke, struck again by the quiet intensity of his conviction. There was more to this story, more to Jacob's involvement than he was saying. But she trusted that he would share those pieces of himself when he was ready, if he ever was. The night of the planned escape arrived, bringing with it a sense of anticipation and dread. Jacob left just after sunset, dressed in dark clothes and riding Thunder, his fastest horse. Tom insisted on getting up, despite Zoe's objections, determined to be on his feet when Sarah arrived. I won't have her see me lying helpless, he declared, hobbling to the table with Zoe's reluctant assistance. She's been through enough worry already. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Zoe tried to keep busy, preparing a late supper that would be ready whenever Jacob returned with Sarah, but her mind kept conjuring worst-case scenarios. What if Pearson had discovered their plan? What if Jacob was caught helping Sarah escape? The penalties for what could be construed as kidnapping would be severe. Just when the waiting had become almost unbearable, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Tom struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the table for support, his face a mixture of hope and fear. The door opened and Jacob entered, followed by a slender young woman wrapped in a dark cloak. For a moment, everyone froze in a tableau of reunion and relief. Sarah, Tom breathed, his voice breaking on her name. Tom. Sarah Pearson rushed forward, her hood falling back to reveal a pretty face framed by golden curls, her blue eyes filled with tears. She embraced Tom carefully, mindful of his injury, then pulled back to examine him with anxious eyes. They told me you were dead. Father said he'd killed you. Takes more than a bullet to keep me from you, Tom replied, his face transformed by love and relief. I promised I'd never leave you, remember? Their reunion was so tender that Zoe felt like an intruder witnessing it. She caught Jacob's eye across the room and saw that he too was affected by the young couple's obvious devotion. There was something in his expression, a wistfulness, perhaps, or a memory of his own that made Zoe wonder if he had experienced such love himself once. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Sarah turned out to be not just beautiful but also practical and determined, helping with the cooking and cleaning despite her wealthy upbringing, and discussing the escape plans with a clear-headed practicality that impressed Zoe. "Father will send men looking for us," she told Jacob as they pored over a map spread on the table. "He won't stop until he finds us." "That's why you need to go far," Jacob agreed. "My friend in Sacramento can arrange passage on a riverboat heading north. From there, you can make your way to Oregon or Washington Territory. Plenty of work for a good ranch hand in those parts, and no one will know or care who your father is." Sarah nodded, tracing the route with her finger. "And we'll be married before we leave California," she added firmly. "I won't give father any grounds to separate us legally." Jacob assured her that his friend could arrange that as well, knowing a minister who would perform the ceremony without asking too many questions. Watching this young woman barely out of girlhood plan her future with such determination, Zoe felt both admiration and a touch of envy. Sarah knew what she wanted and was willing to risk everything for love. Had Zoe ever felt so certain about anything in her life? Her gaze drifted to Jacob, bent over the map, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he pointed out landmarks along the escape route. In that moment, with perfect clarity, Zoe realized that she had indeed found someone worth taking risks for. The knowledge both exhilarated and terrified her. On the morning of Tom and Sarah's departure, the air was crisp with the promise of approaching winter. Jacob had risen before dawn to saddle the horses and load the supplies the young couple would need for their journey. Zoe prepared a hearty breakfast and packed food for the first few days of their trip. The goodbyes were brief but emotional. Sarah embraced Zoe warmly, whispering her thanks for the care she had shown Tom. Tom clasped Jacob's hand, then pulled him into a rough hug. "I won't forget what you've done for us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If there's ever anything we can do to repay you." "Live a good life," Jacob replied simply. "Be happy, that's payment enough." As the young couple rode away, heading north through the pre-dawn mist, Zoe stood beside Jacob in the yard, watching until they disappeared from view. The ranch seemed suddenly quieter, emptier without their presence. "You think they'll be all right?" she asked softly. Jacob nodded, his gaze still fixed on the point where Tom and Sarah had vanished into the morning fog. "They've got love and determination on their side. That's more than most people start with." There was that note in his voice again, a personal connection to their story that went beyond simple compassion for two young people in trouble. Zoe hesitated, then gathered her courage. "You've helped people like them before, haven't you?" she asked, turning to look at him directly. Jacob met her gaze, something shifting in his blue eyes, a decision being made. "Yes," he admitted, "a few times over the years." "Why?" Zoe pressed gently. "Why take such risks for strangers?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving back to the misty hills where the young couple had disappeared. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Because no one did it for us." The simple statement hung in the cool morning air, laden with unspoken history. Zoe waited, sensing that Jacob was on the verge of sharing something he had kept hidden for a long time. "Her name was Caroline," he said finally. "She was the daughter of my father's closest friend, another plantation owner in Virginia. We grew up together, fell in love when we were too young to know better. Or maybe we did know better, but thought love would be enough." Zoe remained silent, afraid that any interruption might cause Jacob to retreat back into his customary reserve. "When the war came," he continued, "everything changed. My father and hers stood with the Confederacy, as did most of our neighbors. But I couldn't. I'd seen the slave markets in Richmond, seen human beings sold like cattle." His eyes flicked briefly to Zoe, a shadow of the anger she'd seen the day of the auction darkening his features. I couldn't fight to preserve that system, no matter what my father believed. So you joined the Union Army, Zoe said softly. Jacob nodded. I was 17, left in the night with nothing but the clothes on my back and a letter for Caroline, explaining why I had to go, asking her to wait for me. He fell silent again, lost in memories. Zoe's heart ached for the young man he had been, forced to choose between his conscience and his family, his love and his principles. What happened? She asked finally. Jacob's jaw tightened. She waited. For 2 years, through the worst of the fighting, she kept faith. Wrote to me when she could, though the letters rarely got through. We planned to run away together after the war, go west where no one would care about which side we'd fought on. The pain in his voice told Zoe that this story did not have a happy ending. But something went wrong, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father intercepted one of my letters, Jacob confirmed. Learned that she was planning to meet me, to leave with a Union soldier, a traitor in his eyes. He locked her in her room, told everyone she was ill with fever. And then he arranged her marriage to a Confederate officer twice her age, but with enough money and status to restore the family fortune that the war had depleted. Zoe felt tears pricking at her eyes, both for the young lovers and for the pain that still shadowed Jacob's face as he recounted the story. By the time I made it back to Virginia, she was already married, Jacob said, his voice flat. I tried to see her to ask if it was what she truly wanted. Her father's men caught me on the property. They would have killed me if her husband hadn't intervened, not out of mercy, but because he didn't want the scandal of a murder on his estate. So you came west, Zoe said, filling in the blank. Jacob nodded. Wandered for a while. Worked ranches in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Finally made my way to California. Saved enough to buy this place 5 years ago. And Caroline, Zoe asked, though she dreaded the answer. Died in childbirth 2 years after her marriage, Jacob said, the words coming out clipped and harsh. Her father had what he wanted, a grandson to carry on the family name and the wealth from his daughter's advantageous marriage. The fact that she was gone didn't matter to him. The bitterness in his voice was raw, even after all these years. Zoe understood now why Jacob had been so determined to help Tom and Sarah. He was giving them the chance he and Caroline had never had. I'm so sorry, Jacob, she said, reaching out to touch his arm. He looked down at her hand, then covered it with his own. It was a long time ago, he said, though the pain in his eyes belied his words. But I swore I'd never stand by and watch someone else's happiness be sacrificed for another's pride or greed, not if I could help it. Zoe moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability he was showing her, this strong, stoic man who carried such deep wounds beneath his calm exterior. That's why you bid for me at the auction, she realized aloud. Not just because of what they were saying, but because you couldn't bear to see someone else being sold. Jacob's gaze met hers, intense and unguarded. That was part of it, he acknowledged, but not all. What was the rest? Zoe asked, her heart beating faster. Jacob hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. His hand came up to touch her cheek gently, as if she were something precious and fragile. I'd seen you before in town, he admitted. Working at your farm stand in the market, always kind, always smiling, even when customers haggled over pennies. You were different, real in a way most people aren't. Zoe blinked in surprise. She had no memory of Jacob at the market, though she had spent many Saturdays there selling her produce before her father's illness had consumed all her time and resources. I watched how you handled yourself that day on the auction block, Jacob continued, his thumb brushing lightly across her cheek. Head high despite their cruelty, dignity intact even when they tried to strip it from you. I admired that. Admired you. The tenderness in his voice, in his touch, made Zoe's breath catch. This was no longer just the story of his past. This was about them, about feelings that had been growing between them for weeks but had remained unspoken. "Jacob," she whispered, unable to find more words. "I know it's not been 6 months yet," he said, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "And I promised you could leave when the debt was paid. That promise still stands, Zoe. I would never keep you somewhere you didn't want to be." "And if I want to be here?" Zoe asked, finding her courage. "Not as your employee, but as—" She couldn't quite bring herself to finish the sentence, but Jacob seemed to understand. The uncertainty in his eyes gave way to something warmer, more hopeful. "Is that what you want, Zoe?" he asked softly. Instead of answering with words, Zoe rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and questioning, but it conveyed what she couldn't yet say aloud, that she had found something precious here on this ranch with this man. Something she wasn't ready to let go. Jacob responded with equal gentleness, his arms coming around her waist to draw her closer. When they finally pulled apart, both a little breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "Never thought I'd find someone who could make me feel this way again." "Neither did I," Zoe confessed. "After everything that happened with the farm, with my father's debts, I thought my life was over, but it was just beginning. You gave me that, Jacob." He shook his head slightly. "You did that yourself, Zoe. All I did was offer you a chance." "You offered me respect," she corrected, "and kindness, and a home. Those aren't small things, Jacob." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face and made the corners of his eyes crinkle. It was a smile Zoe had seen only rarely and never directed at anyone but her. "So what happens now?" she asked, suddenly shy despite the fact that she was still in his arms. "Whatever we want to happen," Jacob replied. "We write our own story, Zoe. No one else gets to decide how it goes." It was perhaps the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her, this promise of autonomy, of shared futures built on choice rather than circumstance. Zoe knew in that moment that she loved him, this complicated, honorable man who had rescued her in more ways than one. "I'd like that very much," she said, smiling up at him. "Our own story." As they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the sun breaking through the morning mist to gild the landscape in golden light, Zoe felt a sense of homecoming deeper than any she had ever known. This place, this man, this life they were building together, it was more than she had ever dared to dream. The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness and hard work. With winter approaching, there was much to be done around the ranch, wood to be chopped and stacked, the last of the garden to be harvested before frost claimed it, preparations to be made for the long, cold months ahead. But now, there was a new dimension to their shared labor. Simple touches as they passed each other in the cabin, stolen kisses when their chores brought them together, long conversations by the fire in the evenings. They were learning each other, discovering the rhythms of a relationship that had grown naturally from respect and friendship into something deeper. Jacob spoke more freely now about his past, sharing stories of his childhood in Virginia, of his time in the Union Army, of the years of wandering that had finally led him to this quiet valley in California. Zoe, in turn, told him about her mother's death from consumption when she was 16, about her father's gradual decline into depression and drink after losing his wife, about her own dreams and fears. They were healing each other, filling the empty spaces left by loss and loneliness with new memories, new hopes. One crisp November evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Jacob reached for Zoe's hand. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident voice. Zoe set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" Jacob took a deep breath. "Your 6 months will be up in February," he began. Zoe's heart sank. Despite everything that had developed between them, despite the kisses and shared confidences, was he still planning to send her away when the contracted time was complete? "Yes," she said carefully, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "That's right." Jacob seemed to sense her dismay because he squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I'm not asking because I want you to leave, Zoe. Quite the opposite." Relief flooded through her. "Oh," he smiled, that rare, transformative smile that made her heart skip. "I'm asking because I want to know if you'd consider staying permanently. As my wife." Zoe's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped, of course, that their relationship was heading in this direction, but she hadn't expected Jacob to propose so soon. "Your wife." She repeated, wanting to be certain she had heard correctly. Jacob nodded, suddenly looking vulnerable in a way that made her love him even more. "I know it hasn't been long," he said, "and if you think we should wait, I understand. But I also know what I feel for you, Zoe. I love you. And I want to build a life with you if that's what you want too." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Jacob, I'll be your wife. I love you too." The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless and blushing. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted when they finally broke apart, "but I'll get one when we go to town next week." "I don't need a ring," Zoe assured him, though she was touched by the thought. "I just need you." Jacob shook his head, his expression tender but determined. "You deserve all the things I can give you, Zoe Blackburn, including a proper proposal with a proper ring." And true to his word, when they rode into Watsonville the following week, Jacob led Zoe directly to the jeweler's shop. The owner, Mr. Fleming, greeted them with professional courtesy, showing them a selection of rings within Jacob's budget. Zoe's eyes were drawn immediately to a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. It wasn't the most expensive ring in the display, but something about its understated elegance appealed to her. Jacob, noticing her interest, asked to see it more closely. "It matches your eyes," he said softly as she slipped it onto her finger, "like the sky on a clear summer day." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Zoe looked up at Jacob, her heart full. "It's beautiful." "Then it's yours," he said, turning to Mr. Fleming to complete the purchase. As they left the jeweler's shop, Zoe couldn't stop looking at the ring on her finger, this tangible symbol of Jacob's love and commitment. She had never owned anything so fine, never expected to. Their engagement became public knowledge as they continued their errands in town. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small communities, and they found themselves receiving congratulations, some sincere, others merely polite, from various townspeople. Not everyone was pleased by the news, of course. Bartholomew Wilkins, observing them from outside his saloon, made a point of calling out as they passed. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for others on the street to hear. "Looks like Everett's making an honest woman of his auction purchase." "How touching." Jacob tensed beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun, but Zoe laid a restraining hand on his arm. "He's not worth it," she murmured, "and he can't hurt us unless we let him." Jacob looked down at her, his anger giving way to something like pride. "You're right," he agreed. Then, deliberately raising his voice so Wilkins could hear, "Let's go home, my love. We have a wedding to plan." The pointed emphasis on love was not lost on the saloon owner, whose smirk faltered slightly as he watched them walk away, heads high and hands entwined. They were married on Christmas Day, in a simple ceremony performed by the minister from the small church in Watsonville. Snow had fallen the night before, transforming the landscape into a pristine wonderland that seemed to Zoe like the perfect setting for new beginnings. Their witnesses were few, just Tom and Sarah, who had risked returning briefly from their new life in Oregon to stand with the couple who had helped them find their own happiness, and a few of the neighboring ranchers with whom Jacob had formed cautious friendships over the years. Zoe wore a new dress of deep blue wool, chosen to match her engagement ring and painstakingly sewn by her own hands over the preceding weeks. Jacob wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his face clean-shaven for the occasion. Scout, not to be left out, sported a new collar with a small bow attached. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the ancient vows taking on new significance as they were spoken by two people who had found love when they least expected it, who had overcome prejudice and pain to build something beautiful together. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared, beaming at the couple before him. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Everett." Jacob needed no encouragement, gathering Zoe into his arms with a tenderness that belied the strength in his tall frame. Their kiss was a promise, a beginning, a declaration to the world that they had chosen each other, now and always. The small gathering moved back to the ranch afterward for a celebratory meal. Sarah, proving herself as adept in the kitchen as she was determined in love, had helped Zoe prepare a feast that would have done credit to a much grander wedding. The cabin was warm with firelight and fellowship, filled with laughter and good wishes for the newly married couple. As evening approached and the guests prepared to depart, Tom pulled Jacob aside for a private word. Zoe, busy saying goodbye to Sarah, couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Jacob's expression change from surprise to gratitude as he clasped Tom's hand firmly. Later, when they were finally alone, Jacob explained. "Tom brought news," he said, standing with Zoe by the window as they watched the snow begin to fall again, soft and silent in the gathering dusk. "George Pearson died last month, heart failure apparently." Zoe looked up at him, understanding the significance. "So Tom and Sarah are free to go home if they want to claim her inheritance." Jacob nodded. "Sarah is her father's only child. With him gone, everything is hers, the ranch, the investments, all of it. They're planning to sell most of the land and use the money to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere without painful memories for either of them." "I'm glad for them," Zoe said sincerely. "They deserve happiness after everything they've been through." "As do we," Jacob replied, pulling her closer. "As do we, Mrs. Everett." The name sent a thrill through Zoe, Mrs. Everett, Jacob's wife. It still seemed somewhat miraculous, this journey from the humiliation of the auction block to the joy of marriage to a man who loved her completely, who saw beyond her size to the strength and resilience within. "I have something for you," Jacob said, breaking into her thoughts. "A wedding gift." He led her to the table where a large envelope lay. "Open it," he encouraged. Curious, Zoe broke the seal and pulled out several official-looking documents. As she read them, her eyes widened in astonishment. "Jacob," she breathed, This is the deed to my family's farm. How did you?" "I bought it," he explained simply. "From the bank. They were eager to sell after sitting on it for months with no takers. The drought made it less appealing to potential buyers, but it's still good land. With proper irrigation, which we can afford to install now, it could be productive again." Zoe stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. "But why? We already have this ranch." Jacob smiled, taking her hands in his. "Because it was your home, Zoe. Because it holds memories of your parents, of your childhood. And because with both properties, we can build something bigger than either of us could alone. A real future, for us and for the children I hope we'll have someday." Children. The word hung in the air between them, filled with promise and possibility. Zoe had always wanted a family of her own, had always imagined herself as a mother, but the hardships of recent years had pushed those dreams aside. Now, with Jacob, they seemed not just possible but inevitable. "Thank you," she whispered, tears of gratitude blurring her vision. "For everything. For seeing me when no one else did. For believing in me. For loving me." Jacob drew her into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I will always see you, Zoe Everett. Always believe in you. Always love you. That's my promise to you today and every day." As they sealed this new vow with a kiss, snow falling gently outside the window and firelight casting its warm glow over their home, Zoe knew that the journey that had begun with humiliation on the auction block had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who had bid loud and glared until they stopped. A man who had seen her worth when others saw only her size. A man who had given her not just a home but a future filled with love and possibility. 5 years later, Jacob and Zoe Everett stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as their 3-year-old son, Daniel, chased Scout's puppies across the yard, his laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Zoe's hand rested on her swollen belly, their second child due to arrive in just a few weeks. "He's going to be a handful today," Jacob observed, smiling as Daniel tumbled to the ground, immediately surrounded by wriggling, licking puppies. All that energy. "Like his father," Zoe replied, leaning against Jacob's solid warmth. "Never still, always curious." "Got his mother's heart, though," Jacob countered. "Did I tell you he shared his cookie with little Emma Harris yesterday when she fell and scraped her knee?" Zoe smiled, picturing their son comforting Tom and Sarah's daughter, who at 2 years old was his most constant playmate. The Harrises had returned to California after all, not to Sarah's father's ranch but to a modest property adjacent to the Everett's expanded holdings. The two families had formed a partnership of sorts, combining their skills and resources to create one of the most successful operations in the county. "This little one is active today," Zoe said, guiding Jacob's hand to a spot where their unborn child was kicking vigorously. "Another boy, do you think?" Jacob's face softened as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "Maybe a girl this time," he suggested, "with her mama's beautiful eyes and kind heart. And her papa's stubborn determination," Zoe added with a laugh. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their son play, feeling their second child move between them, surrounded by the life they had built together. The combined properties, Jacob's original ranch and Zoe's reclaimed family farm, now formed a thriving operation that employed several hands and produced not just cattle but also crops, including Zoe's expanding orchard of apple and pear trees. Watsonville had changed too over the years. New families had moved in, bringing fresh perspectives and diluting some of the old prejudices. Jacob and Zoe were now respected members of the community, their success and obvious happiness having silenced most of their former critics. Even Bartholomew Wilkins had eventually modified his attitude, especially after Jacob and Tom had saved his saloon from burning down during a fire that had threatened half the town. The grudging nod he now offered when they passed on the street wasn't exactly friendship, but it was a far cry from the open hostility of years past. "Remember the first time we went to town together?" Jacob asked suddenly, his thoughts apparently running along similar lines to Zoe's. "After the auction." "How could I forget?" Zoe replied. "I was terrified, convinced everyone was judging me, laughing at me." Jacob's arm tightened around her waist. "And now look at you, president of the Ladies' Aid Society, organizer of the county fair, respected by everyone who knows you." Zoe smiled, acknowledging the truth of his words. She had found her place not just in their home but in the wider community, her natural warmth and organizational skills making her a leader among the local women. The same people who had once mocked her size now sought her advice on everything from canning vegetables to managing difficult pregnancies. "It's because of you," she said, turning to look up at her husband. "You gave me the courage to be myself, to hold my head high no matter what anyone thought." Jacob shook his head. "The courage was always yours, Zoe. I just reminded you of it when you needed reminding." Daniel's excited shout interrupted their conversation. "Papa, Papa, look what Scout found." The boy was running toward them, his small face alight with discovery, the aging but still sprightly Scout at his heels. In Daniel's cupped hands was a tiny, downy duckling, evidently separated from its mother and siblings. "Careful, son," Jacob cautioned, kneeling down to examine the little creature. "It's very young, needs gentle handling." "Can we keep it?" Daniel asked, his blue eyes so like his father's wide with hope. "Please, I'll take care of it, I promise." Zoe exchanged a glance with Jacob, both of them hiding smiles at their son's predictable request. Daniel never met an animal he didn't want to adopt. "We should try to find its mother first," Zoe suggested gently. "It will be happiest with its own family." Daniel considered this, his small face serious. "But if we can't find its mama, then can we keep it? It can be part of our family." Jacob ruffled his son's dark hair. "That's a good heart you've got, Danny. Yes, if we can't find its mother, we'll raise it ourselves. Now, let's go see if we can spot where it came from." As father and son set off toward the pond at the edge of the property, Zoe watched them go with a heart full of love. This was the life she had never dared to dream of: a loving husband, a beautiful child with another on the way, a home that was truly hers, work that brought satisfaction, and respect from the very community that had once ridiculed her. The memory of that day on the auction block had faded with time, but Zoe would never forget the moment when Jacob Everett had bid loud and glared until they stopped, the moment when one man's courage and compassion had changed the course of her life forever. As if sensing her thoughts, Jacob looked back over his shoulder, catching her eye across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, the love in his gaze still made Zoe's heart beat faster. She waved, smiling as he lifted Daniel onto his shoulders to give the boy a better view of the pond where the duckling's family might be found. This was home. This was love. This was the life they had written together, just as Jacob had promised on that misty morning years ago. And it was more beautiful than either of them could have imagined.